Hey guys, and welcome to another one of my tutorials. So in this video, I'll be showing you how to basically combine the third-person template and the car driving template so that you have something where you can walk around and then you can get into vehicles just like this, and then you can drive the vehicles around. You can also switch between third person and first person, and when you do that, it will hide the character so that you can't actually see them, and you kind of look around, and then you can get out and you can get into other vehicles. And so, yeah, again, this is mostly using the template stuff, but what I've done is added the necessary logic to combine the two so that you can walk around as a character and then also interact and get in and out of cars. So yeah, with that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So I'm going to be doing this totally from scratch. So I'm going to open up the Epic Game Launcher, and then I'm on version 4.25.3. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that. I recommend being on this version or newer just to avoid any potential issues. And then we want to select games down here and then hit next. And then for this one, we're actually going to use, let's see, where is it? Top down, the vehicle template, and then hit next. And make sure you have blueprint selected, and we don't need any starter content. So I'll call this driving tutorial, and then go ahead and create the project. And then while that's loading, let me just move this guy over here so I can reference it easily. Okay, so as you can see here, this is just the normal template project for the vehicle. And if you press play, you can see it already works that we can drive it, but there's actually no like player. And so we obviously can't get in or out of it or anything like that. So that is what we're going to be doing next. So in order to get the player, we want to use the guy from the third person template. So you can actually do that quite easily if you go to, I think it's add new and then add feature or content pack. And then you can select the content pack or the feature you want to add. So in this case, we want to add a feature. We want the blueprint feature and we want the third person template. So we want to select this one. And then we can just say add to project. And so as you can see, that basically adds all of the third person template stuff to our project. So if we come back here to the content folder, you can see we have the third person blueprint, and inside of here we have the third person character. So you can just take this guy and drag him into the world. But again, if we press play, you can see we're not actually possessing this character. We still possess the car by default. And that's due to the game mode. So what we want to do is we want to go to our project settings. So we can go to edit, project settings, and we want to go to maps and modes, and then hit this little drop down under the default game mode. And we want to change the default pawn class from sedan, which is the vehicle, to our third person character. So select that, and then come back here. And then one thing we also want to do is, for some reason, they also have the game mode set in the world settings. If you don't see this world settings over here, you just need to go to window and select world settings and it'll show up. But in the world settings, they also have it set. So we just want to undo that, and that will make it basically use whatever we have in the project settings. And so now if we run this, oh, I know why. So we actually need to delete this guy because he's set up to auto possess. Like if you look at the details and you go to possess, you see he's set up to auto possess player 0. So we can either, I guess we can just undo this. And then we can actually just delete this guy as well because we're going to have it set up so that it will spawn us upon at one of these start locations. So if we press play, you can see I spawn at one of the start locations and I can walk around. But you'll notice one thing weird about the mouse, like up is down and down is up, which that's not usually how people prefer it. If you do prefer it this way, then by all means you can leave it. But the reason it's like that is because when you're inside of the car, that's the way it needs to work. But when you're not inside of the car, we want it to work the other way. So all we need to do is go back to our project settings and go to input, go to axis mappings, and then under look up, we want to change this from a positive one to a negative one. So that way it inverts the mouse Y. And then if we run this now, you can see everything is pretty much as you would expect it to be when you are walking around as a character. So the next thing I want to do is make it so that when you walk up to a vehicle, you'll have an option that will pop up to say like press E or F or whatever to enter the vehicle. And then if you press it, you'll enter the vehicle. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go back and we're going to create that little widget. So let's come back to the content folder and then right click and say user interface. And then we want to create a widget. So say widget blueprint, and we will call this the car interact underscore widget. And we can open this guy up for editing. All right, so inside of here, it's going to be pretty straightforward. The first thing we want, we can actually delete this canvas panel over here on the left because we don't want that. We want the root widget to be a size box so that we can control the size of it. And then we only really want to control the width of it, and the height of it we'll let that be determined by however big it ends up being. So hit this little checkbox, and then let's set the width to 200. And then just so we can kind of visualize the size a little bit better, if we come up here, we can say, let's visualize it custom, and then we can set the size ourselves. So we'll say 200 for the width, and then we'll just say 200 for the height as well. Like, it doesn't really matter what you put up here, because again, this is just for visualization purposes, but it's nice to kind of have these values match these values. All right, so we got our size box. We want to add like a background color to it, so we'll add a border. And then we want to set the color of this. So we'll click on it, and then under brush color, we want to set this to like 0, 0, 0 for black, and then like 0.5, just so it's kind of a little bit transparent. And then inside of the border, we want to add a horizontal box because we're going to have two things. So we'll drag a horizontal box onto here. And then for the horizontal box, we want to set it to centered like this. And then inside the horizontal box, we want to add some text. So we'll say text. We want 1, and then we want 2. So actually drag it on twice. So the left text is going to be set to enter vehicle. And then we might need to scale this down a little bit, so because it's a little bit big. So under font, let's set it to like 16. Yeah, that's probably good. And then for the font, let's also set it to be centered. And then for this guy, it's just going to be whatever key you want to use. So we'll just say like E. And then let's set it to be on the right and set it to fill, and then set it to centered as well. All right, and I know it looks a little funky right now, but that's just because we're not really specifying the height of it. We're basically going to tell it to use, like, automatically figure out the height. And when we do that, it will just grab this section right here in the middle. So you'll kind of see what I mean. Okay, so that's all we need to do for that. So now we need to go to our car or our vehicle, and we need to add this to it. So let's come back here and then click on the car, and then hit the edit button on the right to edit the blueprint. So basically what we want to do here is we want to add a widget component. So under components, we'll say add component, and then search for widget. And so where is my viewport? My viewport seems to be missing. Okay, so it adds the widget to the origin, which is kind of underneath the car, so we don't really want it there by default. Let's move it like somewhere right here. It's okay if it's in the middle of the car because the widget's going to be on top of everything. It's like going to be in screen space, so it will look good kind of no matter where you put it, but probably a little bit better to move it somewhere towards the middle of the car. And then for the space, we want to set it to screen, so it's in screen space. The widget class, we want it to be our car interact widget. And then for the draw size, we want to expand this, or no, where is it? We want to hit this checkbox right here. This is draw at desired size. And that's kind of what I was talking about before, where it's going to figure out the size for us, at least for the height. So if we compile and save this, and then we run, and we look at our car, you can see it has the widget showing up on the car. But of course, right now it's just always showing up, which isn't so great. We want it to only show up when we get close to the car, like close enough to actually be able to press E. So for that, we need to implement a system for interacting with objects. So I'm basically going to make a really generic system that you'll be able to reuse for other things in your game if you don't already have one, using an interface. So let's come back here and let's right click and let's go to blueprints, and we want to select blueprint interface. So if you never used an interface before, then I'll try to explain it the best I can, but they basically allow you to share functionality between a bunch of objects that aren't necessarily related to each other. So for example, if we add the interact interface to the vehicle, like you'll be able to interact with it, being able to like walk up to it, press a button and do something with it, in this case, drive it. But you can also use it for other things because you might want to interact with like a light switch or a gun that's on the ground or an NPC. So pretty much anything you want to interact with, we're going to have this interface, and then you can just add that interface to the object and it will allow you to interact with them. So we'll call it the interact interface. And then inside of here, it's going to be pretty straightforward. We're going to have 3 functions. So we want to know when the player gets close enough to interact with an object. So we'll say on interaction range entered, because obviously you can't just interact with something like if you're nowhere near it. And then we also want one for when you like leave that range. So we'll add another one and call it on interaction range exited. And then finally, we want one more for when you actually interact with it. So we'll say on interacted. And then for this one, we want to pass in the player or the pawn that's actually doing the interaction. So under parameters, make sure you have on interacted selected, hit new parameter, and then the type's going to be a pawn. And then the name, we'll just call it the interactor for the person who did the interaction. We compile and save this. So as you can see, this you can't actually define any of these here because this is just an interface. It just defines like what the functions are. So if you want to actually implement these functions, then what you do is you implement this interface inside of whichever class or whichever blueprint you want, and then you can implement the individual functions to, like specifically how you want that class to handle them. So we'll go ahead and do that right now, and hopefully it will kind of make sense. So I'm just going to close this because we don't actually need to open it anymore. And then in our sedan, we want to implement that interface. So to do that, we can go to the class settings, and then under interfaces, we can hit add. And of course, the one we want to add is our interact interface. And so basically what we're saying is that we want this vehicle to be interactable in some way. And you'll see when we do that, over here on the left, you'll see it gives us these 3 interface functions that we defined earlier. If you don't see these over here, that's probably because you're on like a much older version of Unreal. And again, I highly recommend updating to this one just so you don't have any problems. But if you can't find them here on the left, you can go to the event graph and right click. And if you search for their names, they'll show up and there'll be an option to implement them. I don't think I can really show you because that's on an older version, but just in case you are on an older version, you have to search for them here for them to show up. Okay, so anyways, so we want to implement these functions. So the first one we want to implement is on interaction range entered. So we can right click on this and say implement function. And what that does is it brings us back to our event graph and it adds that event of on interaction range entered. We want to do this for the other ones as well. So we'll say implement and then implement. All right, so now what we need to do is set up our player so that he actually calls these functions. And then inside of here, we can kind of do whatever we want. So for right now, I'm just going to add a print string just so you can see like what's happening once we get this working. So we'll print string and we'll say on interaction range entered. And then we'll do the same thing for this guy, except we'll say exited. And then we'll do the same thing for this guy. And we'll say on interacted. Okay, just so you can see what's going on. So before this is going to print, we need to actually call these events. So we're going to be doing that from our player. So if we come back here, and then where is our player? He's not in the scene. Okay, so let's find our player. So we're going to go to third person blueprints, and then open the third person character. So inside of here is where we're going to write the logic for interacting with things, because of course the player is the person who does the interaction. So what we want to know is when the player gets close enough to something to interact with it, we want to notify that thing that we got close to that we are, well, close to it. So what we can do is we can right click on our capsule component and say add event and add the component begin overlap. So this is going to get called whenever we overlap with something. And so what we can say is, does the thing we overlapped with implement this interface? So we'll say does implement interface. And of course, the interface we want to check is the interactable interface. So we're basically checking, like, is the thing we are close to something that we can interact with? And so we'll do a branch to check whether that is true. And if it is true, then we want to call our handy little on interaction range entered function. So I'm just going to add a little reroute node here by double clicking just to organize it. And we will say on interaction range entered. And then we want to do the same thing for exited. And I'm just adding some little reroute nodes here to clean this up. It doesn't really make too much of a difference, but so we want to do the same thing for exited. So we'll right click on or add event, and then we want to say on component end overlap. So this is just going to get called when we stop overlapping with something. And then I'm going to copy these nodes, copy, paste, and hook them up as well. This up, except this time we want to call on interaction range exited, like so. Okay, so this is almost going to work. The last thing we need to do is actually add some collision to our sedan or our vehicle so that we know when we are close to it. So go back to the sedan and then, hold on, give me 1 second. I need to fix something. Okay, and then go to the viewport. And so basically what we want to do is we just want to add a box around this car. So that way when the player gets inside of the box, the player will be considered like close enough to be able to enter the vehicle. So to do that, we can just say add component, and we want to add a box collision. And then we want to set the box to be big enough because right now it's pretty small. So I'm just going to set it to what I had it set to before in my other projects. So for the location, we want -30 on the X, and then we want 110 on the Z. And then for the extents of the box down here, I have it set to 150 by 200 by 100. So there you go. And you can feel free to move this around if you think it's too big or too small or whatever. It doesn't really matter. But the idea is that if the player gets inside of this box, then he'll be able to enter the car. All right. So we can compile and save that. Let me make sure we have the collision set up correctly on this. So we want to change this to, let me see, overlap only pawns for the box because we don't want this box to be overlapping with anything else in our games. Like obviously if you have like bullets or if you have other NPCs or like anything else in your game doesn't really need to care about this box. We really only care about the pawn or the player in this case. So that's why I'm going to set it to overlap only pawns. That way it only triggers overlaps for pawns or players. Okay. So now that we have that, we can go ahead and run this. And we should be able to see when we walk over to the car, you can see at the top left, it says on interaction range entered. And then when we get away, it says on interaction range exited. So essentially what we want to do is we want to tie that little widget, the enter vehicle widget, to show up when we get close to it and then go away when we get far away. All right, so to do that, it's pretty straightforward. The first thing we want to do is we want to set this widget to not be visible by default. So that way, when the game first starts, we won't be able to see it. So we'll go to the visibility, and we just want to uncheck this. And again, make sure you have widget selected over here, and then uncheck that. So now you can see if I run it, it's not showing up at all. So if we come back here to our event graph, and then we're going to get rid of these print strings for right now. And then we want to drag in our widget. So when we enter the range, we want to say set visibility. And so obviously we want to set it to true. And then we want to do the opposite. So I'm just going to copy and paste and set it to false when we exit the range. So now if we run this, you can see when I get close to the vehicle, it pops up. And when I get far away, it goes away. All right. So the next thing we want to do is make it so when we press the E key, we actually get in the vehicle. And that's kind of what this is for, event on interacted. So right now, nothing is calling this. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that or we need to go back to our character and write the code to handle actually calling this. So let's go back to our third person character. And then below these two events, we want to add a third event for when the interaction key is pressed. So I'm just going to add a little input binding to our project settings. So again, edit project settings, except this time we want to go to input. And then we want to add an action mapping, so expand action mappings. So I want to add an action mapping for interaction. So I'm going to hit this little plus key, and we'll call it interact. And then you can set it to whatever you want. I'm just going to set it to the E key, like so. All right, and then we can come back to our third person character. And if we right click now and say input action interact, it will show up with that interact button or that interact event. So basically whenever the E key is pressed, this event will get called. And so what we want to do from here is we want to essentially figure out like what objects we are currently overlapping with, or what interactable objects we are currently overlapping with. And then for whichever one we're overlapping with, like if we are overlapping with any, then we want to call on interacted on that object. So to do that, it's pretty straightforward. We want to take our capsule component and say get overlapped actors. And so this is basically going to do exactly what it sounds like, where it's going to tell us which actors are overlapping with us. And then we want to loop over this. So for each loop, because we only care about the ones that are interactable. So we want to loop over them, and then we want to check. We'll say does implement interface. And of course, we want to check for the interact interface again. And then we can do a branch. So if we do, or if the object that we're overlapping with does implement the interact interface, then we want to call on interacted on that object. So again, I'm just going to create a little reroute node here by double clicking, and then we will say on interacted and hook this up to the true. And then we basically want to exit this for loop. So actually we need to change this to a for each loop with break. So if you right click and you say for each loop with break, we actually want to use this one. So let's just hook this one up instead. So that goes there, this goes there, and this goes there. And then we can delete this and then make sure you hook it up again. And then, so once we find one that's interactable, we want to exit out of this for loop because we don't want to interact with multiple things at the same time. So we can just drag this, and you want to drag it back around and then into the break. And then again, I'm going to add some reroute nodes here by double clicking just to kind of clean this up a little bit so you can kind of more easily see what's going on. And you can use the arrow keys. That's how I'm moving these. Just use the arrow keys. You can move whatever you have selected. And so yeah, again, just to kind of recap, all we're doing here is when you press the interact key, which is E, we get all the actors you're overlapping with, and then we loop over them, and we check each one to see if it implements the interact interface. And then when we find one that does, we call on interacted on that object. And oh, we actually need to pass ourselves. So here it's taking in the interactor, and of course that is ourself. So we can say get ref to self. And so we call on interacted, we pass in ourselves to say, hey, we interacted with you, and then it loops back here and it breaks, and so the loop exits. So now if we come back to our sedan, if you remember from before, we have this little print string here. So now when we press E, it should print out on interacted. So we can go ahead and test that real quick. So if we come over here and we press E, you can see at the top left, it prints out on interacted for however many times we press E. So that seems to be working pretty well. So the next thing we need to do is actually make it so that we enter the vehicle. So over here on the left, let's create two functions. We'll create one for entering, and we'll also just go ahead and create one for exiting for right now, even though we're not going to do that quite yet. So hit the plus button over here on the left and call it enter vehicle. And then for this one, we want it to take in the person entering the vehicle. So we'll say new parameter, and we want it to be a pawn. So we'll say pawn object reference, and then we'll just call it like passenger, I guess. Or maybe driver would be a better word, but I'll just call it passenger. And then we also are going to just make one right now for exit, just so we don't forget. So we'll say exit vehicle, and we'll come back to this one later. Let's focus on the enter vehicle for right now. Okay, so to enter the vehicle, the first thing we want to do is we want to save a copy of this passenger. So let's right click on this and say promote to variable. And then we will save this as a passenger. So this is going to be a reference to like whoever is currently driving the vehicle. And then we can set this to private just because nobody else needs access to it. And then after that, we want to make it so that the player, like the human player, is now possessing the car as opposed to the little character that runs around. So to do that, we can drag off of our passenger and we can say get controller. And we want to tell the controller to go ahead and possess the vehicle. So we'll say possess, and then it's asking for the new pawn that we want to possess. And so that's, of course, ourselves, the sedan or the vehicle. So we'll say get ref to self, like so. So now we are possessing the vehicle. And then from there, we want to attach ourselves to the vehicle. So we'll say attach actor to component. And make sure you use attach actor to component and not attach actor to actor. And then the target is going to be our passenger, because what we want to do here is we want to attach the character himself, like the little mannequin guy. We want to attach him to the driver's seat. So drag in our passenger, and that will be our target. And then our parent is going to be our mesh, because the mesh, if you look in the viewport, the mesh is the actual car itself. So we want to attach it to the car. So we'll drag in our mesh. And then it's asking for a socket name. So we're going to need to add one of those real quick because we don't want to just attach it anywhere to the car. We want to attach him to the actual driver's seat of the car. So if we just add a socket, we can do that pretty easily. So let's just do that real quick. So we want to click on the mesh, and then on the right in the details panel where it has this little purple skeletal mesh, we want to hit the little magnifying glass here, and that will bring us to where it's located. And then we want to open this up for editing. And then we want to add a socket. So what we can do is we want to click on the vehicle base, and then we can right click on this and say add socket. And then we can rename this. So we'll say right click and rename socket. We'll call it drivers socket. And then if you press the space bar, you can switch to the movement mode or the translate thing. And then you just want to drag this up so that it's in the driver's seat. And I'm just going to kind of eyeball it here for right now because it doesn't have to be perfect, but you can adjust this later. And you kind of want to put it so that the socket is kind of at the crease of the seat, because this is where his hips are going to go. And again, you can move this around later. It doesn't have to be like perfect right now, but just add it somewhere over on the driver's side. And it's also important to make sure that the X arrow is facing towards the front of the car, so that way he's facing correctly. And then we can just file and save this. And then I'm just going to close this. And then back in our sedan, we can type in driver socket, because that's the socket we created. And then we want to say snap to target for all of these, so that way he actually snaps to that socket's location. And then, yeah, so we're going to have a couple problems real quick, but I just kind of want to show you what happens if we run this right now. And we actually need to call this as well. So go back to the event graph real quick. And then instead of saying on interactive, we actually want to call enter vehicle. And then for the passenger, it's going to be like whoever interacted with it. So we need to took that up. All right, so this isn't going to quite work. You'll see we have some issues, but it will kind of do something. So if we press E, you can see, well, yeah. So we got in the vehicle, but what happened was that our character started colliding with the vehicle right away. And then the physics engine pretty much couldn't figure out what to do. And so it just exploded, which is basically what happens when you put two things inside of each other, that the collisions kind of overlap with each other. So what we want to do is we want to disable the collision on the character. And we also want to make it so that the character stops moving. So to do that, we could do it in here inside of enter vehicle. We could like take this passenger and we could cast it to a character, and then we could get the mesh and we could disable collision, and we could do all that in here. But a better way to do it would be using another interface, and it would also allow us to notify the player that he actually entered a vehicle. So we're going to do it that way. So let's come back here to the content folder, and then let's make another interface. So we'll go to blueprints and blueprint interface, and we will call this the passenger interface. And then inside of here, we will add two little functions, one for entering a vehicle and one for exiting. So we'll say on enter vehicle, and then add one more and call it on exit vehicle. And then back here in our sedan, we want to, after we possess and before we attach, we want to call that event. So we'll drag in our passenger and we'll say on enter vehicle. And this is basically just letting the passenger know that he is entering the vehicle. And then he'll be able to change his collision or anything else he wants to do like by himself. And then one thing that's a good thing to do now that we are using this passenger interface is over here on the left, before we actually enter the vehicle, we should check that the passenger actually implements the interface. So we will say passenger, or no, not that. We'll say passenger does implement interface, and except this time we want to check the passenger interface. So we want to make sure that this is actually like a valid passenger, and we'll do a branch and set that true up to there. And then again, I don't like it when lines go through each other, so I'm going to make a little reroute node here and hook that up like so, just so it's a little nicer. Okay, so now, again, just to kind of recap, when we enter a vehicle, we're making sure that the passenger that's entering us implements the passenger interface. And we need to do that because if you try to call this on vehicle or on enter vehicle function on a passenger that doesn't implement the passenger interface, it's not going to work. So it's important to do this. And then assuming he does, which he should, then we will set the passenger so we can save a copy of it or a reference to it. And then we will possess the actual vehicle. And then we will call on enter vehicle, which we'll fill out here in a second. And then finally, we are attaching ourselves to the car. Okay, so we need to fill this out so that we can disable collision on ourselves. So if we go back here to the third person character, we go to the class settings, and we want to add the passenger interface, like so. And then over here on the left, we want to say, when we enter a vehicle, we want to right click, say implement function. And so this is going to get called whenever the character enters a vehicle. And so what we can do is we can say capsule component, set collision profile name. And we want to set this to basically, well, I mean, it kind of depends on your game what you want to set this to. You probably could just set this to no collision. If you want the player to like still be able to get shot or something when he's still inside the vehicle, then you'll have to make a custom collision channel for it. Like I can show you real quick if you don't know, but if you go to the project settings and you go to collision, so you can add, you see all these presets here, you can add a new one. So you could add one and then call it like passenger. And then you could say, okay, I want him to ignore everything except for, other pawns, and you could configure the collision to be however you wanted. But for this, I'm not going to do that because we don't really need to. So I'm just going to say no collision. So it basically disables collision on the character when he's inside of the vehicle. So that way he's not fighting with the vehicle. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to disable his movement. So we'll drag in the character movement component and we'll say disable movement, like so. All right, so if we give this a try and we press play, and we go over to our vehicle, and we press E, you can see now he gets in the vehicle, and he's possessing it, so you can actually drive around. And we can't get out yet, but we can at least drive around, which is good. You can see if we press E, it doesn't actually do anything. So the next thing we need to do is make it so that he gets out. Oh, and actually, yeah, we'll do that last. So yeah, the next thing we want to do is make it so we can get out of the vehicle. So to do that, let's see. Let's go, where do we do that code? So we're actually going to need to write that code inside of our sedan, because when we are possessing the vehicle, we're not going to be able to get any input code inside of our character like we did before, because you only get input code for the thing or the pawn that you are possessing. So in order to exit the vehicle, we actually need to add the input check inside of the sedan. So let's go to the sedan and go to the event graph, and then down here below where we did the event on interacted, let's right click and say input action interact. And so whenever they press the E key inside of the vehicle, this one's going to get called. And so we want to call exit vehicle, like so. All right, so if we go inside of exit vehicle, we can fill this out next. So to do this, we basically want to push the character out the side of the vehicle. So we'll drag in our passenger and we'll say add actor local offset. And then this is local, so it's always going to be out the side of the vehicle, regardless of the orientation. And then we can say like negative 150, and we want to select teleport. So it's going to push them out like 150 units to the left of the vehicle. And then we obviously want to detach him from the vehicle. So we'll drag in the passenger again and we'll say detach from actor. And we want to make sure we say keep world for all of these so that he keeps his world space position. And then after that, we want to tell the passenger that he's exited the vehicle so that he can re-enable collision on himself. So we'll drag in the passenger and we'll say on exit vehicle, which is again the interface call for the passenger interface. So we'll have to fill that out in a second. And then after we do that, we want to repossess the mannequin because remember from before, we switched it so that we were possessing the vehicle, but now we want to go back to possessing the mannequin. So we want to say get controller, and we want to say possess. And then the thing we want to possess is going to be our passenger, or the passenger that we used to have at least. So we'll hook that up. So now it's going to be possessing the mannequin again. And then the final thing we want to do is we want to set our passenger to nothing. And what that's going to do is just basically remove the reference to it since it's no longer needed. All right, so I think we got everything for that. So we got on exit. So the one thing we need to do now, because if you run this, you'll see it doesn't quite work. So if we get in, drive a little, and then we get out, you can see he gets out, but he falls through the floor. And that's because we haven't re-enabled collision. So if we go back to our third-person character, we can right-click on the on exit vehicle and say implement function. And so we basically just want to do the opposite of what we did up here. So we want to say, I'm just going to copy these two nodes. We want to set the collision profile name back to what it was before. So if you look at the capsule component and you scroll down, you can see the collision preset is set to pawn. So that's what we want to set it back to. And then we want to set the movement mode to falling because basically when you say character movement, disable movement, what it actually does is it sets the movement mode to none, which disables movement for the character. And so if we set it back to falling, then it will basically resolve the movement correctly. So if he's in the air, he'll keep falling, but if he's on the ground, he'll land and hit the ground. So we'll just say character movement and set movement mode. And we want to set it to falling. Okay, so now if we give this a try, we get in our vehicle, and then we can get out, and we can get in, and we can get out. Okay, so at this point, it's mostly working, but there's a few little minor bugs that you'll notice. So one of them, if you press tab to go into first person, one thing that's not so great, there's a couple things, but one thing that's not so great is that we can see the character. So what we want to do is when we go into first person, we want to hide the characters that he doesn't show. So to do that, we want to go back to our sedan. And actually, where did I do that before? Yeah, so if you go up to toggle camera, so this is the code that handles toggling the camera between first person and third person. We want to drag in our passenger, and we want to say set actor hidden in game. So we only want to hide the actor if the camera is in the car. And that's what this bool represents. This is in car. This means the camera is currently in the car. So if I copy and paste that, we can hook it up here. And so this is going to hide the passenger when the camera is switched to being inside of the car. So if we run this and we go over to our car and we press tab, you can see it now hides. But the problem is that if we get out, he's still hidden. So to fix that, we want to go to our on exit vehicle and then all the way at the end. But before we set the passenger to nothing, we want to drag in our passenger and say set actor hidden in game. And we just want to leave the checkbox unchecked. And so what this is doing is basically just assuring that when he exits the vehicle, he is going to be not hidden. So now if we go and we get in, we switch to first person with tab, and then we get out, you can see we can see him again. But one issue is that if we go back in, he doesn't get hidden, and that's because it's remembering that we were in first person mode. Like it's remembering that the camera was in the car, but it's not running the code to hide it because we're not actually pressing tab. So to fix that, we want to go to our, where is it? Our enter vehicle. And then at the very end, we want to call, where is it? We want to call enable in car view, and we want to set the state defaults. So what this is doing, you can look at this function, but this is basically the function that runs when you press tab. And so this is basically forcing the camera to be out in third person whenever we get in the car, and that's why this is false. So you'll notice now, every time we get in the car, it's going to start with the camera zoomed out. So even if we press tab to go into first person, and then we get out and we get back in, it always starts the view outside, so that way the character is always hidden correctly. So even if we get out while he's hidden, it's still fine. And then the final thing that's a little wonky is that if you press tab and you try to look around, you'll notice the controls are inverted again. And this is kind of what I was talking about at the beginning. Like we want it to work differently when you're in the car versus out of the car. And so to fix that, if you just go to the event graph of the car, there's a little section here where they handle the mouse movement. So it's like all the way on the right here. And we basically just need to multiply this look up by -1. So we'll say float multiply, and we'll multiply it by -1. And we'll put that up like so. And now you can see, so this input's still good. And then when we get in the car and we switch to first person, this input is good as well. So yeah, I think that's it. I'm just going to play around for a second to make sure I didn't miss anything. And while I'm doing this, if you guys liked the video, I would appreciate a thumbs up and a subscribe. I also have a Patreon. If you guys want to support me there, that's always super appreciated. Definitely helps me make videos. I'm just double checking that I didn't forget anything here. So you should be able to add multiple cars as well, like so. So we can get in one car, and we'll drive around and then get in the other car. Yep, so I think everything is working correctly. I just kind of wanted to double check before I ended the video. So again, if you guys like the video, really appreciate a like and subscribe. Otherwise, I will see you guys in the next video.